slides. It will be about our sophomore honors colloquium. I should say as a little intro that when my colleague Marcus Grieger and I started directing the honors program a couple of years ago, we identified the sophomore essay as a pressure point, as it were, that caused attrition of circa 70%. And so we studied the curriculum and, learned more about honors education and also did student surveys, etc., and came to the conclusion that this sophomore essay had to be replaced by something other, and that other is the colloquium. So that's what I'm going to speak about. We just finished the second year of the colloquium, so it's a relatively new development. The sessions I attended yesterday really were wonderful, and two things in particular rang a few bells regarding the presentation today. One was, of course, the three-ring conception and the various principles of intersection at what was called a field of interest and perhaps by extension a theme. The other was Malte Sorensen's wonderful presentation, and he spoke of meeting places across disciplines. Obviously, there are many ways of phrasing these ideas, but the idea of the place, of the meeting place, impressed me very much in relation to the question how researchers, as he phrased it in various disciplines, approach the same theme. So I'm going to try and share the screen here. So I think we can already move to the second slide. The learning goals for the colloquium are defined here briefly. Learning to discern fact from fiction, description from interpretation. So basic categories, obviously, of evaluation, if you want, demonstrating an understanding of analysis, interpretation, evaluation, argumentation, and comparison across disciplines to study a thematic arc or one theme per academic year. Articulating critical thought, in the best sense of making fine distinctions, demonstrating a growing autonomy of interdisciplinary intellectual production, in forms not generally found in the classroom teaching of one discipline alone. So those are the goals, and the goals are also very much embedded in Susquehanna's liberal arts vision, education. And that's why I have just this little reminder of the 7 fields of study in the Liberal Arts College, which are sort of intensified in that sense in this idea of the honors colloquium. Could we move to the next slide? So Kenneth White, a Scottish scholar living in France in the field of geopoetics, is someone very close to my heart. His work is, and he says a colloquium is a speaking together from the Latin colloquere, but also in addition, he likes to think of the word by association, collocare, bringing places, loci, topoi together, and see in a colloquium a relocation of perspectives. That is also that idea that I mentioned Dr. Sorensen discussing meeting places yesterday in that type of spirit that is at the core of the colloquium. The next slide, please. So in the academic year 2019-2020, which was the first year of the colloquium, our annual theme I had chosen was alcohol. Next slide, please. Now, these are the events. The colloquium is structured around a series of 8 to 10 events rather than regular classes. We began in that year with a discussion of Dionysus by a archaeological, by a professor of archaeology and historical research from Texas by way of a film. It was a filmed lecture, a documentary. We moved on to a philosophical lecture of Euripides' Bacchae, obviously the sort of development of the Dionysian idea, but it became politicized. Yeah, it became heavily politicized in that talk. We then went to the science of fermentation by a professor of biology, and you see that we are combining invited guests with guests from our own university. So students have the chance to meet professors they might not meet at their own university because they're not studying biology or other fields. So there is development also in their planning of the curriculum. Some declare minors or other majors. Double majors anyway, in many cases already. So this is has been very inspirational through this exposure to fields of study that are not represented necessarily in their choice of majors when they begin in the first year and as they enter the second. We had an anthropology professor talk about state laws, alcohol laws. We had and this was, for example, a lecture that was in place by our business school. So we asked if we could participate, and we could, on the economics of the beer industry. Then we went to a brewer, a prize-winning brewer, who came and talked quite practically, professionally about the art, if you want, of brewing and fermentation. Then we had a poet who talked about alcoholism and creativity in the 20th century, mainly in America. Then we had our own Carol Weaver, a history professor, who talked about the medicinal use of alcohol in coal mining, to clear the throat and things like that. It was a very interesting and very localized historical perspective. We had planned an excursion to a distillery museum, which got canceled as a result of the pandemic. That's the time also when we went fully online. And I replaced it with a film on addiction that's called Can You Ever Forgive Me? So this is just to give you an overview of the types of events that are the basis of this colloquium. Next slide, please. Now, the next year, I determined that the theme was blood, and we have some students who cannot finish the sequence of 2 semesters in 1 year, but they might do a fall of 1 year, alcohol, and maybe are studying abroad in the spring. So they do the second semester in their 3rd year. So I have this red drop in the middle as a sort of transition from red wine to blood. And the dagger, which is Macbeth's, to obviously the medical implications. Next slide, please. So we started with the film, The Tragedy of Macbeth, which is a very gory, bloody presentation of the tragedy. We had a lecture on Baroque painting and, for example, Artemisia Gentileschi's incorporation of Galileo's theories of projectiles, so the meeting places of science and art. We had a police officer interviewing detectives, a lecture on forensics, followed by a poetry reading of 2 poets from Bucknell and our own Carla Kelsey, but also readings of poetry. One was called Blood of the Sun, of a Brazilian poet, and then an Australian poet on blood and domestic violence. Films and lecture, Precious Blood, a film on vampires, but also a lecture that included in the discussion of vampires theories of anemia and melancholy, a sort of precursor of depression. So there was a historical medical component in that lecture. In the spring, we had a Mayo Clinic doctor talk about hematology, also in relation to gender. We had a race expert talking about 19th century blood trials in the United States. We had a poet laureate who also is from a medical family, who is a specialist in what's called narrative medicine or poetic medicine, talk about also actually hemophilia and creativity. And we had 2 films, one by the Swedish Bergman, Cries and Whispers, that heavily uses the color red and blood very symbolically, And we ended with a Japanese adaptation of the Macbeth plot to sort of come full circle with Kurosawa's film Throne of Blood. So you just, to show you the spectrum of approaches to the one theme. Next slide, please. So the students are required, now that we were fully online for the last academic year, they are required to attend 5 events per year, all 5 events, and participate in the subsequent Q&A. Sometimes there are some preparatory questions that come along with reading materials that they obviously get before the event. In the first year, I also did occasional reading quizzes just to make sure that the preparation is fully in place if the material coming is perhaps not well contextualized or, too culturally different or whatever the case might be. They write in the fall 1 reflection paper per event. It's a short paper of 3 pages. And the fall semester is ended with a final critique of 5 to 7 pages where they pull together the different lenses on the theme at hand. In the spring, they write an outline per event, which means they focus on the current event and they draw comparisons to all previous events. In like 5 major points of observation. And I have an example in a moment. In the end of the year, the final portfolio concludes the work of a year. And that portfolio is, I got anything from 80 to 180 pages. Some are extremely creative. I had a student who painted and wrote poems for each event. Others want to do more of a research type of portfolio where they find additional articles on vampirism, on hematology and hemophilia or whatever the case might be. They have library sessions to learn about the bibliography and style sheets and all that as well. So there are facets that used to be part of the sophomore essay, right? How to do a citation, how to choose the style sheet, what is your discipline in the major, where you maybe want to practice these types of things. So the portfolios take very different shapes. They represent all the events, all the materials we studied together, but they are enhanced by a significant amount of additional material that the student collects, marks up, writes out additionally, and they are asked to restructure, not event 1, event 2, event 3, and keep that, but to restructure thematically and interpretively what they have learned throughout the year. Next slide, please. So this is an example of an outline for one event. It was the Mayo Clinic doctor's talk on hematology, blood and hematology. And the student, as you see, visualized and also spatialized, if you want, connections to all other previous events, ranging from women's health to blood relations, the poetry, to Caravaggio and the idea of nobility of blood and signing in blood, which was the Baroque lecture on painting, to Blood of the Sun, which is the Brazilian poet talking about slaughterhouses and various kinds of blood, literally, and all the other things you might spot, to melancholy as a blood deficiency in favor of the sanguine. So you see there is a huge learning curve also in terms of input. And I know we talk a lot about less input and more processing in a way, which obviously happens here as well. But the input across the disciplines is, I want to say, immense. And this is one example that's obviously very accessible that comes out. This is one assignment out of 5, plus the portfolio in the spring semester. So we could probably move to the next slide. So I have one example of a student who had to split up the 2 semesters over 2 years. So she composed a portfolio on alcohol and blood. And one thing she said is the forensics event, the police detective event, made me examine the vulnerability that blood represents. When people give up blood to be tested for a blood alcohol test, it affects their humanity. Our blood, in both its literal and figurative meanings, is deeply personal, and to have to give it in order to be judged for a crime feels dehumanizing. As a result, I wanted to explore the relationships between officers and their communities. So that's one place, one way she combined the 2 themes, the 2 annual themes, alcohol and blood, and one point of interest where she expanded both with research articles, images, journalistic material on her field of interest. The other is an example from this past academic year. Next slide, please. And that student drew, painted responses to each event, titled them, and wrote a poem to each event. So 10 paintings, 10 poems, and then research articles along with the topics, on desensitization and things like that. So the first on the left, she called Desensitized, and it is a response to Polanski's Macbeth, which is a very bloody film, and we talked about the visual impact a lot. For the International Poetry reading, she has the family portrait Defiled by Truth. This was a lot of poetry on domestic violence. Hematology lecture, she called it Women Still Bleed, and she did a calendar kind of thing here. Medical humanities lecture, What a Doctor Needs, and I don't know if you can see it, but the green thing on the table says poetry because the presenter spoke about brain surgeons actually studying writing with her, and her father being a medical doctor, and the sort of expectations in the family for different fields. And the one on the right, and this is just a selection of 5 out of 20 for Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, and she called it Guilty. And obviously that was the bracket, right, from Macbeth as the first event in the fall to the adaptation of Macbeth in a different culture, Japanese culture, samurai type of setting, with the same questions. Guilt, blood on your hands as guilt. And as a trigger to look at these different types of disciplines. So these are only some snapshots of what we have done, but the themes are of a different nature, if you want, than, say, if we said something like social justice or artificial intelligence, which was a super interesting example and presentation, I think, yesterday. But those are, in a way, raw, less academic as a theme, but they invite takes across centuries, millennia, across cultures, languages, and especially also across the disciplines. The speakers that I have invited, for the better part, are very interested in cross-disciplinary work themselves, so that the Mayo Clinic doctor could talk about social justice when it comes to medical research and to data predominantly available regarding, white populations, for example. Or the poet can address factors in the refrigerator ready for hemophiliacs in the family. So the proximity of medicine and literature, for example, was one major point of intersection and point of interest for the students as well. So my point was to sort of showcase this colloquium. It's a relatively new endeavor. It's 2 years old. Our topic next year, I'm on sabbatical, but the person who teaches it, the topic is ink. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves. And I would very much welcome your questions or reactions to this endeavor, which will evolve as well, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your interesting presentation.
You're welcome.
I was just wondering whether you watch the movies together or you ask the students to watch the movie and then reflect on it.
Yes, that's a very important point, I think, you know, even with discussions like trigger warnings and all these types of things. We, in the first year when we were in person, we watched the movies together. When we went online, I made the movies available to them to watch at their own, you know, according to their own timetables, which can be problematic because it's not the same experience of, say, a Bergman movie, right, that you kind of want to discuss if you've never seen one before. So the answer is both things happened, but my big preference would be for in person and the discussion coming right after with the group in the room. Yeah.
So it's some sort of is like a book club or or movie club that then after
Maybe
that
we
can
should
talk about it.
We would have much higher enrollment yet. Thank you. I'll take that one. Coffee, pizza, movie. Yeah. That could be a way because, I mean, obviously we are rich in movies, right, in film. Maybe with more documentary, that's certainly a direction to think about.
Oh, that's interesting. There is one question I can see that. Does the international population of the students affect the dynamics? And if so, how do you manage around it?
I have to say that in the colloquium, there is very little presence of international students. So I don't have much experience with it. It would be perhaps more in other fields, in other programs. Now, it's more the case that the material is so international and the conditioning is so national in the sense of, especially with movies, actually, because movies, for example, have a very different role in American culture, have had it for a long time. When I tell students that I was 15 when I first went to a movie theater, they think I'm kidding. And I'm not for once, right? So to see a film like from the 60s, you know, out of Japan or out of Sweden with very different types of you know, cultural context, that's actually the issue more in my setting here than to make sure that I would welcome more international students, because I think they would transport some of that, not just vibe, but some of that in a discussion, for example, because they would have a different background in film watching. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case or the issue. Yeah, I wish.